human lab-grown cells called HeLa.
HeLa cells.
HeLa cells.
HeLa cells.
HeLa cells.
HeLa cells, a medical mystery/miracle that has transformed the world of medicine and research. To date, they've been used to develop vaccines, including polio, discovering the 46 human chromosomes, human cells' reaction to space conditions, and so much more. Prior to HeLa, scientists had been unsuccessful in the development of any surviving human cell lines. But after HeLa, they have had access to rapidly reproducing human cells that they could infect and use to test treatments. The term HeLa is often taught and learned about in the scientific community. What is said less often is the name Henrietta Lacks. In 1988, journalist Rebecca Skloot learned about HeLa cells and became curious and inspired to catalog her life, since little was known about her at the time. Decades of research and developing a relationship with Henrietta's family resulted in the 2010 book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta was a Black woman, born on August 1st, 1920 in Virginia. Her life was riddled with racism, fear, joy, and love. She was raised on her family's tobacco plantation, which her family had been working on since the days of slavery. She lived with her grandfather and her orphaned cousin, Day. Her younger years consisted of planting and harvesting tobacco, damming the creek to make a swimming hole, and racing horses on the back roads of the plantation, all with her cousins who grew up on the property with her, and Day, who would later father her children and become her husband. At 14, Henrietta gave birth to her first child, Lawrence, then at 18, her second, Elsie. At 21, after her marriage to Day, she moved to Turner Station, Maryland, so Day could work at a steel mill, where some of her cousins had already moved. While living there, Henrietta had 3 more children: David Jr., nicknamed Sonny, Deborah, and Joe. Her second child, Elsie, had several disabilities and was almost entirely deaf. After her 5th and final child, Joe, her doctor and family members insisted that Elsie be institutionalized, and she was sent to Crownside State Hospital. Henrietta made weekly visits until her sickness prevented her from going. Henrietta had been to the doctor before, but rarely accepted treatment. In 1951, shortly after having Joe, Henrietta felt a marble-sized lump inside of her and was experiencing irregular bleeding. She went to Johns Hopkins, the nearest hospital that treated Black patients. Her doctor collected a sample of the tumor growing in her cervix, which was passed along to the head of tissue culture, George Guy. Henrietta did not consent to the collection of her cells or their use for research. Sadly, this was standard practice at the time. Black patients often couldn't afford to pay for treatment in full, so white doctors felt that their tissue was fair compensation. This mindset is not unlike present-day views of people who live in impoverished communities. Removal of agency from people in financial need is not something that America has grown out of. Henrietta began treatments for the cancer, which involved sewing tubes of radium into her cervix, and did not tell her family. It is believed that she did this because she valued their well-being over her own. Her cousins remember Henrietta as a fun and charismatic woman who loved to go dancing. I mention this because it is important to remember Henrietta as a whole, 3-dimensional person, not just a medical study. After her first round of treatment, Henrietta returned to Johns Hopkins, started another round of radium treatment, and had to go to the hospital daily for X-ray treatments, which burned nearly all of the skin off of her abdomen. She told her family that she was no longer sick, and made excuses to cover for the fact that she had to travel daily to the hospital. After this bout of treatment, doctors told her she was healthy, a practice common at the time referred to as benevolent deception, which actually means lying to patients for their own good. Henrietta was in horrible pain, and the doctors found another tumor as well as gonorrhea. She lost the ability to walk and was checked into inpatient. She died shortly after. The year was still 1951. Life for the Lacks family after Henrietta's death was difficult and riddled with trauma. The 2 youngest grew up not knowing their mother and were barred from asking about her. They were cared for by their father and the eldest, Lawrence, until Lawrence was drafted to the military. After that, their father's cousin Ethel and her husband Galen moved in to help. Devastatingly, this did not fare well for the children. Galen sexually assaulted Deborah, and Ethel beat Joe. After 2 years at a base in Virginia, Lawrence moved into a home with his girlfriend, Babette, who helped look after Deborah and Joe. Deborah had her first child at 16 and still managed to graduate high school with the help of Babette. Joe dropped out in 7th grade and eventually joined the military, although he was discharged due to bouts of anger. After his time in the military, Joe stabbed a man from his neighborhood who had previously threatened him. He later turned himself in, and while in prison, he found Islam and changed his name to Zachariah. The family did not have a good relationship with medical providers, for good reason, and didn't know about HeLa cells until decades after they were harvested. For more perspective, in 1963, 12 years after Henrietta's death, when Deborah would have been about 14, researchers at Johns Hopkins attempted to prove that Black individuals were genetically predisposed to criminal behavior by testing the blood of 7,000 Black children. It can be assumed that many, if not all, of the families did not consent to this research due to the consent practices at the time. Continuing the horror of the time were trials done throughout the 1950s by a researcher named Chester Southam. He became worried that HeLa was dangerous for his researchers. What did he do to ensure its safety? He lied to cancer patients and told them he was conducting a new immune test then injected them with HeLa, a cell strain that was known to convert cells. Unsurprisingly, nodules grew on his patients on the arms that had been stuck with HeLa. In 1963, an apparently terrifying year for medicine, Southam intended to continue his unethical research at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in Brooklyn. Thankfully, 3 of the doctors at the hospital compared the tests to the research done by the Nazis. They resigned and sent their letters of resignation to the press, exposing the experiments. As a result, the Board of Reagents revised the guidelines for research, increasing the ethical barriers, and the National Institute of Health, or the NHI, began requiring board approval for all experiments conducted on humans. Southam was barred from medical practice for only a year. In her adulthood, Henrietta's only living daughter, Deborah, found herself wanting to know more about her mother's life, leading her to assist in the research for Skloot's nonfiction book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. During their research, Deborah reached out to doctors, but found most of them unwilling to explain HeLa to her in a way that she found helpful. One researcher, Christoph Lengauer, defied this and invited Deborah and Zachariah to his lab. There, he showed them the cells and how to view them under the microscope. He admitted that Johns Hopkins was wrong in their treatment of them and told them that he thinks they are owed compensation for the profit of the cells. He also gave them his personal phone number if they had any questions they needed to ask. The timeline I've provided is barely scratching the surface of what Deborah and her siblings went through. There's generational trauma that cannot be ignored. Duke University defines generational trauma as the transmission or sending down to younger generations of the oppressive or traumatic events of a historical event. This is to say that past generations teach the next generation how to emote and cope with events. So the past experiences of a family are passed down. Today, the Lacks family still has not been compensated and cannot afford healthcare or higher education. Meanwhile, for-profit companies benefit and continue to sell HeLa cells.
70 years after her death, the family of Henrietta Lacks is suing a biotechnical company over cells that were taken without her consent. Scientists have used those very cells in countless medical breakthroughs. But for the Lacks family, that doesn't justify what they call the exploitation of her body.
The cells are sold for research purposes by companies including Thermo Fisher Scientific. But the Lacks family and its attorneys say those cells were stolen and that Thermo Fisher's business, quote, is nothing more than a perpetuation of this theft.
These pharmaceutical companies are making billions upon billions of dollars, and Henrietta Lacks' family hasn't made one red dime.
Henrietta's grandson, Ron, says it's about reversing a decades-long injustice.
Recently, people have begun to talk about Henrietta, and her grandson, Ron Lacks, has even written a book titled Henrietta Lacks, The Untold Story, which was published in 2020.
My dad was the eldest son of Henrietta, and seeing what my ancestors went through, it was my honor to try to change the narrative. Pharmaceutical companies had on their website, they had up, these are stolen cells from Henrietta Lacks. It's like that they didn't care that they was taking advantage of the Lacks family. This is for all the marbles. What I'm doing to this day is getting justice for the Lacks family. I just want everyone to know what my dad shared with me, that Henrietta was this bright, beautiful black woman that loved life. I put a copy of her signature on my book, and she had beautiful penmanship. I mean, if you could tell a lot by someone's signature, when you look at that signature, it's as beautiful as her picture.
The story of Henrietta Lacks is a story of racism, sexism, neglected consent, denied agency, abuse, medical law, scientific discovery, and so much more. To ignore any of these points would be to diminish the experiences of the Lacks family. However, there is so much to unpack that it would take hours to discuss it all. Topics that have not been discussed at length are Deborah's medical struggles, marriage and children, the lives of the older Lacks boys, Lawrence and Sonny, Zachariah's struggles with mental health and family life, and the abuse and testing done on the second eldest Lacks child, Elsie, at the Crownside State Hospital prior to her death in the same year as her mother, 1951. It is easy to ignore all of the bad surrounding HeLa cells, especially in the wake of all of the discovery they have aided in. But still, Henrietta Lacks and her story is dynamic and must be engaged with in order to put a stop to the pattern of ignoring Black suffering in medicine. This woman was denied the truth of her condition, the option of consenting to research, and her future because of her race, gender, and income. Her cells may have been 1 in a million, but her treatment was common practice and is not extinct. Please, pay attention to Black stories, uplift Black voices. If you are interested in learning more about Henrietta and her family, you can read about them in The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot, or Henrietta Lacks, The Untold Story by Ron Lacks. To contribute to individuals who have made important contributions to scientific research without personally benefiting from those contributions, visit the Henrietta Lacks Foundation at henriettalacksfoundation.org. Or for more information on how to meaningfully engage with Black stories and how to take action, visit blacklivesmatter.com.